Japan, 1954. Part 1. A quiet village by the sea. The village of Kurashima rested on the edge of the Pacific, cradled by the calm waters that both sustained and threatened its existence. Tucked between jagged cliffs and the vast, shimmering ocean, the small village seemed to float between two worlds, one of serenity and one of hidden danger. On most days, the village was quiet, its simple homes with thatched roofs basking in the early morning light, casting long shadows over the cobbled streets. The air was thick with the scent of salt, wood smoke, and the lingering aroma of fish from the previous night's catch. It was a humble life, but for the villagers, it was enough. Hiroshi, a man in his mid-40s with calloused hands and deep-set eyes, stood at the shoreline, watching the horizon as if expecting some unspoken message from the sea. The morning was unusually still, too still. The usual chatter of fishermen preparing their boats, the shrill calls of seabirds, and the rhythmic crashing of waves were conspicuously absent. Even the wind seemed to have forgotten the village today, leaving an unsettling silence in its wake. Hiroshi was a man of few words, but his presence spoke volumes. Towering over many of his fellow villagers, his weathered face told the story of a life lived at the mercy of the ocean. His faith, however, set him apart. In a village steeped in Shinto and Buddhist traditions, Hiroshi's Christian beliefs were considered peculiar, almost foreign. He had embraced Christianity after a series of encounters with Western missionaries, whose message of hope and salvation resonated deeply within him. This faith had earned him the reputation of being an outsider, but Hiroshi didn't mind. His faith was personal, and it gave him strength in ways the others couldn't understand. As he gazed at the water, his fingers absent-mindedly traced the worn cross that hung from his neck. The village behind him was waking up, the soft clatter of footsteps echoing from the homes built precariously close to the shore. Fishermen, some of them lifelong friends, passed by, giving Hiroshi nods of acknowledgement, though none stopped to speak. They knew Hiroshi's routine. He always prayed before setting out to sea. But today was different. His wife, Aiko, emerged from their small, wooden home nestled among the rocks. She was a gentle woman, her hands always busy with some task, yet her heart always focused on the well-being of her family. Her long, black hair was tied back loosely, and she wore a simple kimono, the colors faded from years of wear. As she approached, her soft voice carried a note of concern. "Hiroshi, there's something wrong today. The sea, it feels uneasy." Hiroshi turned to her, his brow furrowed in thought. Aiko had always been attuned to the rhythms of nature, often sensing things that others missed. Her unease only added to the heavy feeling in his chest. "I feel it too," Hiroshi admitted, his eyes returning to the horizon, which was growing brighter as the sun continued its slow rise. "But God watches over us, Aiko. Whatever comes, we will be ready." Aiko's eyes, usually filled with warmth, reflected the uncertainty she felt. "Be careful today," she whispered, glancing toward the sky where the birds, normally circling and calling at this hour, were conspicuously absent. "The air feels different." Hiroshi nodded, though the knot in his stomach tightened. He kissed her forehead gently, the familiar scent of salt water and earth lingering between them, then turned toward his boat, a modest vessel, weather-beaten and well-worn from years of service. It was not much, but it was his livelihood. As he prepared to push the boat into the water, the silence weighed heavier on him. The villagers went about their morning routines, unaware of the ominous feeling that hung in the air. Hiroshi couldn't shake the sense of impending disaster, as if the sea itself was holding its breath. He knelt beside his boat, the cold, damp sand pressing against his knees, and bowed his head in prayer. "Lord, grant me wisdom today. Protect my family, my village, and all who face the waters. Show me your will." He rose slowly, feeling the reassuring weight of the cross against his chest. Just as he took hold of the oars, a low rumble reverberated through the ground beneath his feet. It was faint, almost imperceptible at first, like a distant echo of something buried deep within the earth. Hiroshi froze, his hands gripping the oars tightly as the tremor passed. He looked up, scanning the horizon for any sign of disturbance, but the sea remained eerily calm. A few moments later, the ground shook again, this time stronger, more insistent. Hiroshi's heart raced. He had lived by the sea long enough to recognize the signs of danger. Earthquakes were common in Japan, but this felt different. There was a malevolent energy in the air, a tension that seemed to pulse from the depths of the ocean itself. Villagers began to gather in the streets, their voices rising in confused murmurs. Children clung to their mothers, and the elderly shuffled to find solid ground. Hiroshi watched as fear spread through the village like wildfire. He knew what was coming before anyone else did. A tsunami. The word itself sent a chill down his spine. Hiroshi had heard stories passed down from generations. Stories of monstrous waves that swallowed entire villages whole, leaving nothing but ruin in their wake. But those were tales, distant and ancient. Now, standing on the edge of the sea, he knew that such devastation was no longer a distant memory. It was here, and it was real. As the tremors grew stronger, Hiroshi's mind raced. He needed to get back to the village, to warn them. But before he could act, something caught his eye in the water. A small object, bobbing up and down with the waves, making its way toward him. It was unlike anything he had ever seen before, an ancient-looking scroll, weathered and bound with a thin strip of cloth. The sea, which had just moments before felt like a predator, now seemed to deliver this relic with a strange, deliberate gentleness. Hiroshi's heart pounded in his chest as he reached into the water and grasped the scroll. It was soaked, but remarkably intact. With trembling hands, he unraveled the cloth and carefully opened the fragile paper. Though the language on the scroll was foreign to him, written in ancient script that he couldn't understand, there was something about it, a presence, a divine clarity that pierced through his confusion. He felt, deep within his soul, that this was a message from God. Without wasting another second, Hiroshi gathered his strength and ran toward the village, clutching the scroll to his chest as if it held the key to their survival. His mind raced with the enormity of what was about to happen. The ground trembled again, this time so violently that villagers began to scream in terror, some falling to their knees in prayer, others running toward the hills in a desperate attempt to flee. Hiroshi, Aiko's voice cut through the chaos, and he turned to see her running toward him, her face pale with fear. "There's no time to explain," Hiroshi said, grabbing her arm. "We need to go. Now." "But the others," she began, her voice shaking. Hiroshi's grip tightened on the scroll. "Trust me, Aiko. God has shown me the way. We must climb the mountain." Aiko hesitated for only a moment before nodding, her trust in her husband, and in his faith, overcoming her fear. Together, they turned toward the looming mountain in the distance, the highest point in the region, and began their ascent. The roar of the approaching wave grew louder, like the deep, guttural growl of a beast awakened from its slumber. Behind them, the village descended into chaos. Hiroshi could hear the desperate cries of his neighbors, the frantic scramble of feet on the cobblestones. But he knew there was no time. The wave would spare no one in its path. And so they climbed, leaving behind the only life they had ever known. Part 2. The Ancient Manuscript. The small house Hiroshi shared with Aiko stood at the edge of the village, nestled between towering cliffs and the unpredictable sea. Inside, the modest wooden walls were adorned with simple decorations. A few family heirlooms, a wooden cross carved by Hiroshi himself, and a small shrine where Aiko would light incense for their ancestors. The air inside was thick with the smell of salt and earth, a mixture of the sea breeze that seeped through the cracks and the faint aroma of fish from the morning's meal. Hiroshi rushed inside, the ancient manuscript clutched tightly in his hand. His heart pounded, not just from the physical exertion of running, but from the weight of the message he held in his grasp. Aiko followed close behind, her breath shallow, her face pale with worry. The tremors of the earthquake still reverberated through the ground, but the worst was yet to come. Inside their home, The world felt momentarily still. The sounds of panic and chaos outside were muffled by the wooden walls, but Hiroshi knew that time was slipping through their fingers like sand. The tsunami was approaching, and they had precious little time to act. He glanced down at the manuscript, its parchment old and fragile, yet imbued with an aura of ancient wisdom. Aiko's voice broke through his thoughts. "What is that, Hiroshi? Where did you find it?" He met her gaze, his dark eyes filled with a mixture of awe and urgency. "It found me," he said softly, his voice almost reverent. "I was on the shore when it came to me, floating in the water. It's a sign, Aiko. A message from God." Aiko's brow furrowed, her eyes flicking toward the manuscript. Though she had long since accepted Hiroshi's faith, she still found it difficult to understand the depth of his belief. She trusted him, loved him, but the idea of divine intervention in a moment like this was almost too much to grasp. "What does it say?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Hiroshi ran his fingers over the parchment, tracing the unfamiliar characters. The script was ancient, its meaning elusive, yet he felt a strange clarity wash over him, as if the words were speaking directly to his soul. He didn't need to understand the language to know what it was telling him. There was an undeniable truth in the message, something that transcended language and culture. "It's a warning," Hiroshi murmured, his eyes wide with realization. "We must leave the village. There's a mountain to the east, and we need to go there now. God is guiding us." Aiko's heart raced as she took in his words. The ground beneath them trembled once more, and the distant roar of the ocean began to grow louder, more insistent. The walls of their home creaked as the force of the coming disaster seemed to pulse through the very earth. She could feel the panic rising in her chest, but she knew Hiroshi well enough to recognize the conviction in his voice. "If you believe it, Hiroshi, then I believe it too," Aiko said, her voice steady despite the fear that gripped her. "But what about the others? We can't just leave them behind." Hiroshi turned toward the door, his jaw set with determination. "We'll warn them, but they must choose for themselves. Not everyone will believe, and we don't have much time." The tremors outside grew stronger, rattling the wooden beams of their house. The distant sound of the ocean became a low, menacing growl. Hiroshi knew the sea well enough to understand what was happening. The water was receding, pulling back into the depths, gathering strength for the inevitable wave that would soon follow. It was only a matter of time before the ocean would come roaring back, crashing down upon their village with unimaginable force. Hiroshi and Aiko stepped outside, and the sight that greeted them was one of chaos. Villagers were running through the streets, their faces pale with terror as they scrambled to gather what little they could. The tremors had shattered windows and knocked over market stalls, scattering goods across the cobblestone streets. Children clung to their parents, their cries drowned out by the growing roar of the sea. Hiroshi raised his voice, shouting to anyone who would listen. "There's no time. We must leave the village. The mountain to the east. God has shown me the way." Some villagers stopped to look at him, confusion and fear etched on their faces. Hiroshi's reputation as a devout Christian had always set him apart, and now, in the midst of this disaster, his warning seemed both desperate and strange. Many of the villagers continued to run in all directions, searching for shelter, their belief in traditional practices guiding their actions. They headed toward shrines, hoping for divine intervention from the kami of their ancestors. But Hiroshi knew the truth. This was not a test of the old gods. This was something far greater. A few villagers, however, hesitated. They looked at Hiroshi with uncertainty, torn between the fear of the coming wave and the strange hope that he offered. Among them was Yuki, a young fisherman who had always admired Hiroshi's strength and quiet resolve. His face was pale, his hands shaking as he clutched his fishing gear. He stepped forward, his voice trembling. "Hiroshi, do you really think we'll be safe if we follow you?" Hiroshi met his gaze with unwavering conviction. "I know we will. God has shown me the way." Yuki glanced back at the terrified crowd, then at the distant mountain that Hiroshi had spoken of. The decision weighed heavily on him, but something in Hiroshi's voice, something in the way he spoke with such certainty, made Yuki take a step forward. "I'll come with you," Yuki said, his voice steady now. "If you're right, I don't want to stay here and find out what happens." A small group began to form around Hiroshi, their faces a mixture of fear and hope. Mothers with their children, fishermen, and even a few elders who had known Hiroshi since childhood. They looked to him now, not as the outsider with strange beliefs, but as their leader, the one who might save them from the coming disaster. Hiroshi nodded, his heart heavy with the weight of their trust. "We must move quickly. There's not much time." As they began their journey toward the eastern mountain, Hiroshi felt the manuscript tucked safely inside his robe, its presence a constant reminder of the divine guidance that had come to him in the moment of greatest need. The ground beneath their feet trembled again, and the sky above them darkened, as if nature itself was mourning the devastation that was about to unfold. The path out of the village was narrow and winding, flanked by tall, jagged rocks that cast long shadows in the fading light. The group moved swiftly, their footsteps quickening as the distant roar of the ocean grew louder. Hiroshi could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken fear that clung to each of them. Yet he walked with purpose, his faith guiding every step. As they reached the outskirts of the village, Hiroshi glanced back one last time. The village that had been his home for so many years now seemed impossibly small, fragile in the face of the oncoming storm. He thought of the others, those who had chosen not to follow, those who had placed their faith in the old shrines and traditions. His heart ached for them, but he knew there was nothing more he could do. They had made their choice, just as he had made his. The mountain loomed ahead, its jagged peak rising above the landscape like a sentinel. It was there, in the shadow of the mountain, that Hiroshi knew they would find safety. It was there that God had led them, and it was there that they would survive the storm. As the group continued their ascent, the wind began to howl, carrying with it the distant roar of the approaching wave. Hiroshi felt a deep sense of calm settle over him, even as the ground shook beneath his feet and the sky darkened overhead. The manuscript, now hidden from view, had delivered its message. They were on the path to salvation, but the journey was far from over. With each step they took, the weight of the tsunami grew heavier, the power of the ocean surging ever closer. Hiroshi could feel it, an unstoppable force, bearing down on them with unimaginable fury. Yet through it all, he held on to his faith. Part 3. The Climb of Faith. The group trudged along the narrow, rocky path that wound its way up the mountain, the sound of their hurried breaths mingling with the eerie silence of the darkening sky. The earth beneath them trembled intermittently, sending loose pebbles tumbling down the mountainside, but the true menace was the deafening roar behind them, the sound of the ocean withdrawing, gathering its strength for the inevitable strike. The sea had become a predator, and every second they spent climbing was one less they had before the tsunami crashed onto the shore. Hiroshi led the group with a fierce sense of purpose, his heart pounding with the weight of responsibility. Behind him, Aiko climbed steadily, her face flushed from the exertion. The others followed, their footsteps quick and uneven as fear drove them up the incline. There were no words exchanged, only the sound of boots scraping against rock and the occasional gasp of exhaustion. Yuki, the young fisherman who had been one of the first to follow Hiroshi, struggled to keep up. His legs burned with the effort of the climb, and every breath felt like a battle. He had never climbed the mountain before. Most of the villagers rarely ventured beyond the village limits, and this path was foreign to him. Yet, despite his growing fatigue, he refused to let himself fall behind. Something about Hiroshi's unwavering faith gave Yuki the strength to push forward, even as the earth groaned beneath their feet. Hiroshi glanced over his shoulder, ensuring the group was still intact. His eyes met Yuki's, and he offered a brief, encouraging nod before turning his gaze back to the path ahead. The steep, jagged trail demanded their full attention, but the sound of the ocean's fury was impossible to ignore. The distant roar had transformed into a monstrous growl, a low rumble that reverberated through the ground and rattled the bones of anyone who heard it. The tsunami was coming. The path ahead grew steeper, more treacherous, forcing the group to slow down as they navigated the uneven terrain. The mountain loomed above them, its rocky slopes casting long shadows that seemed to swallow the world around them. As they climbed higher, the air became thinner, cooler, carrying with it the faint smell of rain. Hiroshi's eyes were fixed on the summit, still a distant silhouette against the darkening sky, but he felt an inexplicable pull toward it, a divine force guiding him, urging him to move faster. The group was small, but their fear was palpable. Each person's face told a story of dread and desperation, of lives torn from normalcy by the looming disaster. A mother held her child tightly to her chest, her eyes wide with terror as she stumbled over the uneven ground. An elderly man, too frail for the steep climb, leaned heavily on a younger villager who supported his weight. Even Aiko, usually so composed, looked over her shoulder every few moments, her gaze filled with silent prayers for the safety of their village and for the mercy of the sea. Hiroshi could feel the tension growing, like a wire stretched too thin, ready to snap. The weight of leadership pressed heavily on his shoulders. He had led them away from their homes, away from everything they had ever known, based on a faith that few of them shared. But he had no time for doubt. His belief in the message from God was absolute, and that certainty was the only thing keeping him moving forward. His fingers brushed against the scroll hidden in his robe, feeling its texture, as if drawing strength from the ancient manuscript that had sparked this desperate journey. A sudden, violent tremor shook the ground beneath them, knocking several villagers off balance. Yuki stumbled, barely catching himself before he fell, while a few others cried out in alarm. The mountain groaned under the pressure, the tremor echoing through the rocks like a warning. Hiroshi paused for a moment, his heart racing, and looked up. The path ahead was narrow, with jagged cliffs to one side and a sheer drop to the other. Any misstep could send them tumbling down to the rocky valley below. "We have to keep going," Hiroshi called out, his voice firm but calm. "The higher we climb, the safer we'll be. Don't stop." The group pushed onward, though exhaustion was beginning to take its toll. Sweat dripped from their brows, and their legs burned with the effort of the steep ascent. The air felt heavy with the impending disaster, the pressure mounting with every step they took. Suddenly, from behind them, there was a sound, a distant, primal roar that filled the sky with its terrifying power. Hiroshi didn't need to turn around to know what it was. The tsunami had reached the shore. Aiko gasped, her hand instinctively reaching for Hiroshi's arm. "Hiroshi, the wave." "We're almost there," Hiroshi said, though the summit still seemed impossibly far. His voice was steady, but even he could feel the rising panic. They were running out of time. The roar of the wave grew louder, like the howl of a furious beast closing in on its prey. The group quickened their pace, driven by the fear of what was behind them. Hiroshi's heart raced as he climbed, every muscle in his body screaming for rest, but there was no rest to be found. Not now, not until they were safe. As they rounded a bend in the path, the group came to a brief plateau, a small, flat stretch of ground that overlooked the village below. For the first time, Hiroshi allowed himself to glance back, and what he saw made his blood run cold. The village of Kurashima was already being swallowed by the sea. The monstrous wave, taller than any building, darker than the storm clouds that loomed overhead, crashed onto the shore with a force that defied belief. It surged forward, devouring everything in its path. Houses, boats, market stalls, and even the mighty trees that lined the coastline. The wave didn't slow. It moved with the relentless power of nature's fury, consuming the village as if it were nothing more than a fleeting memory. Gasps of horror rippled through the group as they watched their home disappear beneath the water. The place where they had lived, loved, and built their lives was now unrecognizable, buried beneath the wrath of the sea. Aiko's hand tightened around Hiroshi's arm, her breath catching in her throat. "It's all gone," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the roar of the tsunami. Hiroshi's heart ached as he watched the destruction unfold, but there was no time to mourn. The wave was still coming, relentless, unforgiving. He tore his gaze away from the devastation and turned back to the group. "We have to keep moving. We can't stop now." The villagers nodded, though their faces were pale with shock. Some of them were openly weeping, their tears lost in the wind. But they followed Hiroshi, driven by the same fear and hope that had brought them this far. They had no choice but to trust him now. The path grew steeper still, the air thinner and colder as they climbed higher into the mountain. The roar of the tsunami faded slightly as they ascended, but the sense of urgency never left them. The weight of what they had witnessed, the complete and utter destruction of their village, pressed heavily on their hearts. Yet they had to believe that they were being spared for a reason. Minutes passed like hours, every step a battle against exhaustion and fear. The summit was close now, visible through the thickening mist that clung to the mountain like a veil. Hiroshi felt a renewed surge of energy, a burst of strength that carried him up the final stretch of the path. At last, they reached the top, a flat plateau that overlooked the entire coastline. Hiroshi stopped, his chest heaving, and turned to face the sea. Below them, the remnants of Kurashima were almost entirely submerged, the wave having claimed the village in its entirety. The ocean, now calm once more, lapped gently against the shore, as if mocking the destruction it had wrought. Hiroshi fell to his knees, overcome with emotion. Tears blurred his vision as he gazed out at the devastation, the weight of it all pressing down on him like a physical force. The others gathered around him, their faces pale and drawn, their eyes fixed on the ruins of their home. It was over. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. The wind whispered through the trees, and the distant sound of the ocean seemed far away now, a reminder of the destruction that had passed. Hiroshi's mind swirled with questions, with grief, and with an overwhelming sense of awe. They had survived, but at what cost? Aiko knelt beside him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. "Hiroshi," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You saved us." Hiroshi shook his head slowly, his voice barely audible. "No, Aiko. God saved us." He reached into his robe and pulled out the manuscript, holding it carefully in his hands. The ancient scroll had guided them here, to this place of safety, and now, as they looked out over the ruins of their village, Hiroshi understood its purpose. It was not just a warning. It was a testament to the power of faith. They had been spared, not by chance, but by the grace of God. Part 4. The Aftermath. The air was heavy with a silence that felt unnatural, as if the earth itself was holding its breath in the aftermath of the disaster. The survivors stood at the top of the mountain, their faces pale and gaunt from the terror and exhaustion of the climb. The wind, once a fierce, howling force as they ascended, now only whispered softly through the trees, offering no comfort, only a reminder of the chaos that had passed. Below them lay the ruins of Kurashima, a village that had once bustled with life, now reduced to rubble and debris scattered across the landscape, swallowed by the sea's wrath. Hiroshi stared down at the shoreline, his heart sinking into a depth of sorrow he had never known before. The village, their home, was gone. The once familiar streets, the humble homes with their thatched roofs, the small wooden boats that lined the dock, they were all unrecognizable, buried beneath the mud and detritus left by the colossal wave. The sea, now calm and deceptively peaceful, lapped gently at the shore as if mocking the destruction it had just wrought. In its stillness, it seemed to deny the violence it had unleashed upon their world. Hiroshi took a deep breath, the scent of salt water and damp earth filling his lungs. His knees felt weak, not from the physical exertion of the climb, but from the weight of the grief that pressed down on him. The silence around him was broken only by the quiet sobs of the villagers who had made it to the summit. Aiko stood beside him, her face streaked with tears, her hands trembling as she clutched his arm. The others were gathered in small groups, some kneeling in prayer, others simply staring in disbelief at the devastation below. As much as Hiroshi had prepared himself for this moment, seeing it with his own eyes was something he could never have imagined. He had been spared, they had been spared, but at the cost of everything they had ever known. The village of Kurashima, which had stood for generations, was now little more than a memory. "We made it," Yuki said quietly, standing beside Hiroshi. His voice was barely a whisper, as if speaking too loudly would break the fragile stillness that surrounded them. His young face was drawn and pale, his wide eyes filled with a mix of shock and disbelief. "But everything, it's all gone." Hiroshi nodded slowly, his gaze still fixed on the distant shore. "We survived," he murmured, more to himself than to Yuki. "But the village—" His words trailed off, lost in the overwhelming sense of loss that hung in the air. What could he say? How could he possibly make sense of what had just happened? They had followed the path laid out for them by God, trusting in his guidance. But now, looking down at the destruction, Hiroshi's heart ached with questions. Why had they been spared when so many others had not? What purpose could there be in such devastation? Aiko's voice was soft, barely audible. "Hiroshi, what do we do now?" He turned to her, and the pain in her eyes mirrored his own. She had always been strong, always the one to hold him steady in moments of doubt. But now, even she seemed lost. Her faith had carried her this far. But now they stood on the edge of an uncertain future, and the answers they sought seemed far beyond their grasp. "We rebuild," Hiroshi said finally, though the words felt hollow in his mouth. "We rebuild, and we honor those we've lost." It was a simple answer, but it was all he had to offer. The weight of leadership pressed heavily on him as the villagers began to gather around, their eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hope. They looked to him now, not just as the man who had led them to safety, but as the one who would lead them forward in the days to come. Their faith in him was palpable, but so was their grief. Slowly, Hiroshi made his way down the mountain, the manuscript still tucked safely in his robe. His steps were slow and deliberate, the weight of the scroll a constant reminder of the divine intervention that had saved them. But the closer he got to the ruins of the village, the more overwhelming the devastation became. The familiar paths and landmarks were gone, replaced by a chaotic mess of debris. Wooden beams from shattered homes, broken pottery, remnants of fishing nets, and personal belongings scattered like forgotten memories. When they reached the base of the mountain, the reality of what they had survived hit them with full force. The bodies of those who hadn't made it lay half buried in the mud, their faces frozen in expressions of terror and disbelief. Hiroshi swallowed the bile that rose in his throat, his hands shaking as he bent down to say a prayer over the lifeless forms. These were people he had known, neighbors, friends, people whose lives had been intertwined with his own for as long as he could remember. Now they were gone, taken by the sea, leaving behind only the haunting silence of their absence. The surviving villagers began the grim task of gathering the dead, their movements slow and heavy with grief. There were no words spoken, only the soft sounds of weeping and the occasional murmur of a prayer. Hiroshi worked alongside them, his heart aching with everybody they pulled from the wreckage. He felt the weight of each life lost, each future that had been cut short, and yet through it all, he held on to the knowledge that they had been spared for a reason. The manuscript had shown him the way, had guided them to safety, and now it was up to them to carry on. As the day wore on, the survivors began to sift through the ruins, searching for anything that could be salvaged. A broken teacup, a battered family photograph, a piece of driftwood that had once been part of a home. All were gathered with reverence, small fragments of a life that had been irrevocably changed. Hiroshi moved among them, offering words of comfort where he could, though his own heart was heavy with sorrow. It was in this moment, as they stood among the ruins of their past, that Hiroshi felt a new sense of clarity. The manuscript had been more than just a warning. It had been a sign of hope, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming destruction, there was a path forward. It was not an easy path, nor was it free from pain, but it was one that they would walk together, guided by their faith. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting a golden glow over the devastated landscape, Hiroshi gathered the survivors around him. The air was cool now, and the wind carried with it the scent of the sea, though it no longer held the same threat. The village was gone, but they were still here. They had been spared for a reason, and now it was time to rebuild, not just their homes, but their lives. "We have been through the worst of it," Hiroshi said, his voice steady as he addressed the group. "We've lost much, but we have not lost everything. We are still here, and as long as we have each other, we can rebuild. The sea took our village, but it did not take our faith." The villagers nodded, their faces still drawn with grief, but now filled with a glimmer of hope. They had followed Hiroshi to safety, and now they would follow him in the days to come. Together, they would rebuild Kurashima, not just the village, but the spirit of the people who had called it home. Hiroshi looked out over the sea, the waves gently lapping at the shore. The manuscript rested in his hands, its ancient wisdom a reminder that even in the face of disaster, there was always a way forward. It was not the path they had expected, but it was the one they had been given, and Hiroshi knew in his heart that they would find their way. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Hiroshi whispered a quiet prayer, his gaze still fixed on the horizon. "Thank you, Lord, for guiding us through the storm. Give us the strength to rebuild and the faith to carry on." And with that, the survivors of Kurashima began the long, painful process of rebuilding their lives, one step at a time, one prayer at a time, with the manuscript as their guide and their faith as their foundation. Part 5. A Legacy of Faith. 5 years had passed since the great wave had swallowed the village of Kurashima, and yet the memories of that day remained etched in the hearts of the survivors, as if it had happened only yesterday. The village, once a peaceful seaside community, had been rebuilt piece by piece, its people stronger and more resilient than ever before. The scars of the disaster were still visible, both in the landscape and in the eyes of those who had witnessed the destruction, but Kurashima now stood as a testament to the power of faith and perseverance. The rebuilt village, though modest, was more fortified against the whims of the sea. New homes, sturdier and positioned further inland, stood as a symbol of survival and resilience. Wooden structures were replaced with stronger materials, and the once fragile docks had been reinforced, though fewer boats now lined the harbor. The fishermen still ventured into the waters, but always with a wary eye on the horizon, never forgetting how the sea could turn from a source of life to a force of destruction in an instant. Hiroshi stood at the edge of the village, gazing out at the ocean that had both taken so much and given them back their strength. His face, weathered and lined with age, bore the marks of a man who had seen both immense loss and miraculous survival. The manuscript, now housed in a simple shrine built by the villagers, was revered as a symbol of divine intervention. It had become part of the village's lore, passed down from generation to generation, a story told to children about the day God had spoken to them through the waves. The village gathered in prayer often now, more than ever before. Every year on the anniversary of the tsunami, the villagers would gather at the shrine, where Hiroshi would recount the story of the wave, the manuscript, and the miraculous journey to the mountain. It had become a time of reflection, of honoring those who had been lost, but also a celebration of the lives that had been spared. Hiroshi was now viewed not just as the village's elder, but as its spiritual leader, a role he never sought but accepted with humility. He had never seen himself as anything more than a simple fisherman, but God had shown him a path, and he had followed it. Now, the villagers came to him not just for advice on fishing or building, but for guidance on matters of faith, on how to navigate the storms of life that went beyond the physical. This particular morning, the sky was a clear, vibrant blue, and the village hummed with life. Children played in the streets, their laughter ringing out in stark contrast to the fear and sorrow that had once gripped this place. The markets bustled with activity, as fresh fish and vegetables were sold, and the sounds of hammers and saws echoed as the final stages of rebuilding took place. It was a day like many others, but it held a weight that not everyone could feel. Aiko approached Hiroshi, her steps slow but purposeful. Her hair, now streaked with gray, was pulled back neatly, and her hands, once so strong and steady, bore the marks of time and labor. She stood beside him, her gaze following his toward the sea. 5 years, she said softly, her voice carrying a mixture of awe and sorrow. It feels both like a lifetime ago and as if it were yesterday. Hiroshi nodded, his hand reaching out to clasp hers. The warmth of her touch grounded him, reminded him that through all the pain and loss, they had survived together. "We've come far," he said, his voice steady but filled with the weight of memory. "But the past never truly leaves us." Aiko squeezed his hand gently. "No, but it also reminds us of how strong we are, of what we can endure." Hiroshi smiled faintly, though his heart still carried the sorrow of those they had lost. Every time he told the story of the tsunami, of the manuscript that had saved them, he felt the weight of the lives that had been swept away by the sea. It was a burden he bore willingly, knowing that their survival had not been by chance, but by divine grace. That afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, the villagers gathered once more at the shrine. The atmosphere was solemn, the weight of the anniversary heavy in the air, but there was also a sense of hope, of renewal. Hiroshi stood at the front, the manuscript carefully placed on the altar behind him, its worn pages a silent reminder of the miracle that had taken place. The villagers, now a mix of old and young, bowed their heads in prayer. Even those who had once doubted Hiroshi's faith now stood in reverence, their hearts filled with gratitude for the life they had been granted. Hiroshi spoke with a quiet authority, his voice carrying across the gathering. "We are here today not just to remember what we lost, but to honor what we have gained," he began. His eyes scanned the crowd, landing on the faces of those who had been with him that fateful day. Yuki, now a father himself, stood with his young daughter by his side. The elderly man who had struggled up the mountain now sat in the front, his hands clasped in prayer. "We were spared by God's mercy, not for ourselves, but for a purpose. Our survival is not a gift to be taken lightly." He paused, the weight of his words settling over the group. The manuscript that saved us was more than a warning. It was a message, a call to faith in the face of fear, a reminder that even when the world seems darkest, God's light will guide us. The crowd nodded in agreement, their faces filled with reverence. Hiroshi continued, his voice steady and calm. "We have rebuilt our village stronger than before, but it is not the walls of our homes that make us strong. It is our faith. It is the knowledge that we were saved for a reason, and that we must live our lives in service to that reason." He turned slightly, his hand resting on the manuscript behind him. "This is our legacy. Not just the physical village we have rebuilt, but the faith that binds us together. It is a faith that will carry us through whatever storms may come, whether from the sea or from the trials of life." As he finished speaking, the villagers remained silent for a moment, their heads bowed in contemplation. Then, slowly, one by one, they approached the shrine, each offering a prayer of gratitude. It was a tradition that had begun the first year after the tsunami, and it had continued every year since, a ritual of remembrance, of honoring the lives lost and the faith that had saved them. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the village, Hiroshi felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. The weight of leadership, of guiding his people through such immense loss, was still heavy, but it no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a calling, a path that he had been meant to walk all along. He watched as the villagers slowly dispersed, their hearts lighter, their steps steady. The village was thriving once more, and while the memory of the tsunami would never fade, it no longer held them in its grip. They had moved forward, rebuilt their lives, and found strength in their faith. As the last rays of sunlight faded from the sky, Aiko came to stand beside him once more. She slipped her hand into his, and together they stood in silence, watching as the stars began to appear one by one in the darkening sky. "We've done it, Hiroshi," Aiko said softly. "We've rebuilt." Hiroshi nodded, his gaze still fixed on the horizon. "Yes," he replied, "but the work never ends. We must continue to build, not just our village, but our faith." Aiko smiled, her eyes reflecting the gentle light of the stars. "And we will, together." Hiroshi's heart swelled with gratitude, not just for the survival of their village, but for the life he had been given, the faith that had carried him through the storm. As he looked out over the rebuilt Kurashima, he knew that their legacy would live on, not in the walls they had erected, but in the strength of their belief, the power of their faith, and the enduring story of the miracle at sea. And so, as the village settled into the quiet of the night, Hiroshi whispered a final prayer. His words carried on the wind, a testament to the faith that had guided them through the darkest of days. Thank you, Lord, for everything. If this story moved you, please leave a comment below to share your thoughts and experiences. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, God bless you.